to go on the record just for a second? But you're going to have the truth come up. Division 5 looks the same as it did yesterday. Is that going to get cleaned up today?
That's right.
All right. Make sure it is.
We're waiting for the jury to the trial proceeding to be done today. So that
And that's fine. I just didn't want you to forget. I know you got a lot to do.
Thank you.
Got a problem? Hmm? I don't know. I'm over here. It's hard for me to see because I'm trying to keep track of evidence on this. Oh, that's right. They're fungible. One DA is as good as another. We rise for the jury, please. All right, we can be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start, I'm informed that we're running slightly behind schedule. You guys have a life, which I understand, so we need to get back on schedule. Normally, nothing's changing today, okay? But normally, what we do is an hour and a half for lunch, and the reason we do that is, one, to give you guys enough time, but the main reason that I do it is the attorneys are working on this case constantly. They need that time to get everything prepared, make things run smoothly, and I often have a lot of stuff I have to do too. So we're not just wasting that full hour and a half when you guys might think we are. But if we took an extra 15 minutes off that lunch hour, you know, for as many days as this trial is scheduled to go, that would certainly help get us done faster. And so I want you to think about if you're okay with an hour and 15 minutes for lunch. I'd also like to push back our stopping time, but I don't know what kind of issues you guys would have if I did that in terms of childcare or other commitments that you might have. So think about it, and I'd like you to hear from you. I'll talk to Cindy about it either this afternoon or on Monday about how long it'd be okay to stay. Not very far, because if I keep the jury after 5:30, you guys can't follow anything. Well, maybe you guys can, but other juries couldn't. I have trouble after 5:30 too, just because it's a hard day. So it would only be 15 to 30 minutes if we stay late each day. We get back on time, we'll go back to the normal schedule. So, but I'm gonna get you guys out of here when we said we got you out. We're gonna get you out of here. So just be thinking about it. With that, Mr. Doherty.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Strut, it occurred to me during the break that before we start working through the crime scene with the jury, I should ask you a couple more questions. One is about partial profiles. Can you explain to the jury what a partial DNA profile is?
If there is not enough DNA in the sample that we're trying to develop a DNA profile, we may only obtain some of the DNA at some of the locations, and we indicate that as a partial DNA profile rather than a full, complete profile, which would be all 16 locations.
And during the time you were working on this case, 2012 through 2014 or so, how many locations were you looking at for purposes of DNA analysis?
The kit we were using looked at 16 different locations.
Is that something, one of those changes over the last 18 years or so?
Yes.
And just tell the jury briefly, what do you mean by location?
Their locations, they're referred to as loci, and that location is the more common term that we're looking at on the DNA molecule that are giving us the DNA peak.
So for something to be declared a match, for example, how many locations would you have to have?
That we deem something a match if it matches the reference sample and the question sample at all those different locations, and then we do stats to support that match.
And then briefly with regards to mixtures, we touched on this briefly when we talked about hand on the shoulder. Can you tell the jury how DNA mixtures work, please?
Mixture is when more than one individual has contributed their DNA to a sample. We can identify a mixture if we have 3 or 4 what we call alleles or peaks at the different locations, then we deem it a mixture.
What do you mean by peaks at the location?
That is the graphical depiction is a peak in a DNA profile.
Your Honor, with that, I'd like to put 340 back on the screen, please.
All right, go ahead.
Your Honor, would it be okay with the court if, while using the microphone, I went up to the screen?
Yes.
Thank you. So for each one of these locations, Ms. Strub, we have a CBI number,
That is correct.
and those are the numbers we've been referring to throughout your testimony.
Yes.
So I'd like to start with CBI number 1. What location was that?
That is the swabs that were collected from the east couch cushion from room B.
So up here on the top right.
Yes.
So the luminol test positive, the swabs did not indicate positive results of the blood in the lab.
When they were tested, the swabs that were collected on scene when they were tested in the lab were negative for the presence of blood. That is correct.
What are the possible reasons that it would test positive at the scene but not positive at the lab?
Again, the sample was collected after luminol was applied to the couch cushion, and you're diluting out what is already not visible. And again, I take a very small cutting of the swabs that were collected, and the swabs themselves have a white film on there, so there's no way for me to tell where the blood may have been on those swabs. So that small cutting that I'm taking, in addition to all the dilution that may have occurred when they process the luminol and then when they take their swabs, there's no way for me to know if I'm getting the exact area on the swab. So the swab itself, the small snippet, was negative for blood.
So it sounds like 2 reasons there. One is where you're cutting on the swab,
That's correct.
and 2 is the effect that luminol has in terms of diluting something that's already been made invisible to the naked eye.
Correct.
So with luminol, fair to say, good news, bad news, you're finding blood that you can't see. At the same time, you use liquid that could be invisible.
That's correct.
Eating.
It's okay for that question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Honor. So let's turn to the DNA analysis on item number 1, please. And again, we're talking about the couch east cushion. What was your DNA analysis of the swabs from this area?
The DNA profile developed from the swabs from the east couch cushion of room B indicates a mixture of at least 2 contributors. Mark Redwine, Corey Redwine, and Dylan Redwine cannot be excluded as potential contributors to this mixture. Elaine Redwine and Mr. Stone can be excluded as potential contributors to this mixture, and the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random who cannot be excluded as one of the possible contributors of DNA to this mixture at the locations listed in my report is approximately 1 in 604.
And Judge, for the remainder of this witness, I'd ask that she testify from memory and use her report only to refresh her recollection instead of just reading her report to the jury like she just did?
I don't think that's going to be possible. Is that possible to do?
Not really.
Is your report an accurate reflection of the results that you found?
Yes, it is.
In this case, I will allow it. Normally, I wouldn't. So I understand your objection, but I think it's appropriate to be able to read this time.
Thank you, Your Honor. At least 2 contributors on CBI number 1. What does that mean?
There was at least 2 individuals that contributed to the DNA profile that was developed from that item.
You say Mark Redwine, Corey Redwine, and Dylan Redwine cannot be excluded as contributors. What do you mean by that, if you can explain it to the jury?
Their profiles are part of that mixture. Because they're related individuals, they are going to share a lot of alleles at the different locations. So I can't decipher between the 3 of them, but it is a mixture of at least 2 individuals.
And is this a partial or full DNA profile that you're able to develop?
It was a full DNA profile, but there was only certain locations that I could do stats at.
And what do you mean by that?
When we're looking at a DNA profile, if they are not at that location, or if I have dropout of their particular allele at that location, I do not do stats at that location.
But you did mention a stat of 1 in 604.
That is correct.
And what is that regarding?
That is stats at the locations that are listed in my report.
And you were able to exclude Elaine Redwine and David Stone as potential contributors to CBI number 1.
That is correct.
And with regards to mixtures, is that something in the world of DNA analysis that changed after you left CBI?
Yes, with the more advances in technology and the more sensitive kits coming out, there has been changes to mixture interpretation.
Thank you. We're going to turn now to item number 2, the luminol love seat south cushion. Do you recall that it tested positive for blood at the crime scene based on the information submitted to you at the lab?
That is correct.
And when you tested the swabs in this area, CBI 2, for blood at the lab, what was the result?
They were positive for the presumptive presence of blood.
And did you then conduct a DNA analysis on item number 2?
I did.
What was the result of the DNA analysis for item number 2?
The DNA profile from the swabs from the love seat of the south cushion of room B, item 2.1, matches the DNA profile developed from Dylan Redwine. The estimated frequency of this profile in the general population is approximately 1 in 28 quintillion.
What do you mean by that?
The rarity of that profile, the frequency that you're going to see that profile in the general population is estimated at 1 in 28 quintillion, which is 28 followed by 18 zeros.
So to a degree, or reasonable degree of scientific certainty, and in the absence of an identical twin, is Dylan Redwine the source of the DNA profile that you developed at CBI?
Yes, and that was the terminology that was used at the time this report was written. We had a source attribution statement, which reflected to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty.
And since then, along with other changes in the world of DNA, has the terminology that's used changed?
Yes, it has.
So with regards to item number 2, your work indicated the presence of Dylan Redwine's DNA at item 2?
That is correct.
And blood at item 2?
Yes, it was presumptive positive for blood.
Let's go to item 3. The floor under the rug and coffee table. Is this another location, item 3, where blood was found at the crime scene based on the information submitted to you at the lab?
Objection. This states the evidence. It was a presumptive luminol test, not that blood was found.
Probably correct. Please be. I mean, I don't remember.
Sure. I actually think counsel's right. That's fine.
Okay.
I'll be more precise. Presumptive luminol test at the scene tested positive blood at that location in item 3.
The laboratory testing of the swabs from that particular location were positive for the presumptive presence of blood.
And also the information provided to you by the crime scene investigators that was the result they had at the location item number.
That's correct.
And then you put this forward for DNA analysis with regards to item 3. What were the results of your DNA analysis, Ms. Strut?
The DNA profile that was developed from the swabs from the floor under the rug/coffee table of room B indicates a mixture. Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine cannot be excluded as potential contributors to this mixture. Elaine Redwine, Mr. Stone, and Mark Redwine can be excluded as potential contributors to this mixture. And the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random who cannot be excluded as one of the possible contributors of DNA to this mixture is approximately 1 in 12 billion.
So Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine cannot be excluded on CBI number 3. What does that mean?
They are both detected, or you can see both of them in that particular mixture.
So you see Dylan's DNA developed from the blistex and the baby tooth in the analysis you conducted on the swabs from item number 3.
That's correct.
Now, it's under the rug, but not on the rug itself. In your opinion, what does that mean to you?
Objection, foundation, not a crime scene analysis. She's a serologist and DNA expert.
Mr. Doherty?
Your Honor, she's been qualified as an expert in forensic serology and forensic DNA. I'm asking her why nothing was found on the rug, but DNA and serology tests indicate under the rug.
And I think that's
Hold on a second.
holding.
Ms. Strub, is this something that's within your expertise?
As far as, no, it is outside the scope of DNA.
So let me rephrase it then. We don't have any presumptive positive for blood on the rug. What does that mean?
There was no sample for me to do DNA on from the rug itself.
Or to do a blood test or presumptive blood examination on the rug itself.
That's correct.
And it's, however, under the rug, you were provided swabs that indicated the positive test for blood. Is that right?
That's correct. The stain was collected from underneath the rug.
And also the DNA profile that you just described as being Dylan and Corey Redwine, and you said 1 in 12 billion.
That's correct.
Can you just talk to the jury briefly about item 4, please?
A DNA profile was not able to be developed from the swab from the pipe near the washing machine of room L.
Item 5 is over here. The floor in front of the love seat, south cushion, room B. Were you aware that this had tested presumptively positive for blood at the crime scene based on the information provided to you by the investigation?
Yes.
And what were the results of your test for blood at the laboratory?
The swabs tested negative for the presumptive presence of blood in the laboratory.
And what would be the reason or reasons for that difference between at the scene and in the laboratory?
Again, it's similar to the situation from the swab in item 1. I would have taken a very small sample from the swab, and those swabs were collected after luminol was applied, and there was a number of liquid that was applied that's going to dilute the sample. And again, the small cutting that I took from the swabs were tested negative for the presence of blood.
Following the test for blood, you then submitted it and went through the process for DNA analysis on item number 5?
That is correct.
And what were the results of your DNA analysis on item number 5, Ms. Wood?
The DNA profile developed from the floor of the swabs from the floor of the front of the love seat, the south cushion, indicates a mixture of at least 2 contributors. Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine cannot be excluded as potential contributors to this mixture. Elaine Redwine and Mr. Stone were excluded as potential contributors to this mixture. And no conclusions could be drawn regarding whether or not Mr. Redwine was included in that mixture. The probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random who cannot be excluded as one of the possible contributors of DNA to this mixture at the locations listed in my report is approximately 1 in 10.6 million.
You mentioned Mark Redwine in that conclusion you just read. Can you tell the jury a little bit more about that analysis, please?
There was not enough genetic information for me to make any conclusions to determine whether or not Mr. Mark Redwine was in that sample.
Thank you. Let's turn to item 6, the coffee table in the northeast corner. Were you aware when you received the submission from the investigators that location had tested presumptively positive for blood?
Yes, I was.
What did you do when you received the swabs for that particular location?
Again, that set of swabs was presumptively tested in the laboratory, and it was positive for the presumptive presence of blood.
And after you tested it, and it was presumptively positive for the presence of blood, what was the result of your DNA analysis with regards to item number 6, Ms. Strut?
The DNA profile developed from the swabs from the coffee table of room B indicate a mixture. Mark Redwine and Dylan Redwine cannot be excluded as potential contributors to this mixture. Elaine Redwine, Mr. Stone, and Corey Redwine can be excluded as potential contributors to this mixture, and the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random who could not be excluded as one of the possible contributors to this mixture as the locations listed in my report is approximately 1 in 760,000.
Your Honor, with that, I'm going to step back to the podium.
Go ahead.
Ms. Strub, can you please talk to the jury about YSTR?
YSTRs is another type of kit that is utilized in DNA analysis. It is specific to the paternal lineage or the male line. YSTR testing was conducted in this case in order to put the missing person profile that was developed from Dylan Redwine's baby tooth into a database so that it could be searched across the U.S. Those type of samples need 2 different technologies. So we have the YSTR profile that was also developed from his baby tooth, as well as the YSTR profile that was developed from both Corey Redwine and Mr. Mark Redwine. Those are going to be the same. They're passed down paternally, so anybody paternally related would have the same YSTR profile. So any males are going to have the same YSTR profile as their father, as their grandfather, that is paternally related. If you have any sons, your son will have the same YSTR profile.
Your Honor, if this testimony doesn't concern 340, I'd ask that it be taken down.
All right, that's fine.
So just to recap there, Ms. Strub, my brothers and I, assuming we share the same father, would have the same YSTR profile as one another and as our father.
That's correct.
How about my sisters and me?
No, female is not going to have a YSTR profile because they do not have the Y gene as part of their DNA profile. It's unique to males.
Who shared a YSTR profile in regards to this case?
Dylan Redwine, Corey Redwine, and Mark Redwine all had the same YSTR profile.
Once you used the YSTR profiling analysis you just described, what was done with the results as to Dylan Redwine?
The profiles were put into the CODIS database in order to determine in the event that there was remains or an individual identified outside the state. That is used as an investigative tool to help when individuals are missing.
What is the, excuse me, what other kinds of samples can be put into the CODIS database?
There are relatives of missing persons that are put into the CODIS database. There are also samples that are put in from labs. All question samples throughout the U.S. can be put into the CODIS database to be searched against other types of samples that are in the database. We have convicted offenders that are also put into the database.
And that's based on national and state standards?
Yes, it is.
And all DNA profiles that are developed be uploaded into the CODIS database?
No, there are certain requirements that have to be met that allow us to put different profiles into the CODIS database.
What are some of those requirements, Ms. Strub?
Most labs are labs that produce, do samples from evidence samples, so question samples can be put into the database. If it is collected from a suspect in a case and matches them, those are not eligible to go into CODIS. We have, if individuals give samples for elimination, those are not allowed to go into CODIS. Victims are not uploaded into CODIS. Relatives of missing persons, when that person is identified, those profiles are removed from CODIS. They do not remain in there, and they are voluntarily submitted for the purposes of trying to find an individual. They are aware that they may go into CODIS for that purpose, but if the remains or the individual is located, those profiles are removed from CODIS.
So fairly, excuse me, fair to say it's highly restricted in terms of what can be put into CODIS and under what conditions it may be removed from CODIS?
Yes, it is.
How about partial profiles?
Partial profiles are allowed in when they meet certain parameters for the search parameters that are set up by the national index.
Generally speaking, what would that be?
It is dependent on the state, but there are certain numbers that have to be met based on whether or not it's going to hit on something, and it's calculated by the database.
And are you referring to the number of locations developed in a partial profile?
Yes, we have to have a certain number of locations. They have to be certain locations. Because the kits have evolved and changed over the years, there are certain ones that have to be there, and if they're not, they can't go into CODIS.
Okay. All of what we've discussed with the jury up to this point is work you did before the body of Dylan Redwine was recovered. Is that right?
Before there were bones that were recovered, yes.
And you continued to work on this case throughout 2013?
That is correct.
Did you receive a submission to the CBI laboratory on January 14th of 2013? And if you need to refresh your recollection by looking at your report, I would just ask you to indicate what you're looking at for the record.
There was a submission. I am looking at the report, the submission of January 14th, 2013. The date of the report is February 14th of 2013. It was a black and white Nerf football.
So the submission was on January 14th. The report's generated on February 14th.
That's correct.
And what was the item you tested?
It was a black and white Nerf football.
What did you test it for?
I was looking for the presence of blood on the football. I did a visual as well as presumptive serological examinations on the football.
What were the results of that examination?
The presumptive serological examinations did not indicate the presence of blood.
And then turning to a submission in June of 2013, did you receive a variety of items, in June of 2013?
Yes, I did.
What did those items include?
There was a Nike Air Jordan shoe, a Fila sock, a shoelace, and 3 bones.
What date were those submitted to the CBI laboratory?
June 24th of 2013.
What date did you produce results and generate the report?
The date of the report is June 27th of 2013.
So that's just 3 days later.
That's correct.
Can you tell the jury about that process, please?
This was a case where there were bones that were recovered, and they wanted a determination very quickly if those bones belonged to Dylan Redwine.
Did you conduct a presumptive serological examination for the presence of blood on the shoe, sock, and shoelace?
Yes, I did.
What were the results of those tests?
They did not indicate the presence of blood.
How about DNA analysis on the shoes, the shoe, sock, and shoelace?
All of those items were swabbed to do DNA analysis on.
And what were the results of the DNA analysis that was conducted?
DNA profiles could not be developed from the 3 samples that were taken from the shoe. I took samples from the inside of the shoe, the outside of the shoe, as well as the sole, as well as the sole of the shoe. There were swabs taken from the sock and swabs taken from the shoelace, and I was not able to develop profiles from any of those items.
If you were told Dylan Redwine wore that shoe, wore that sock, used that shoelace to tie his shoe, what would be the possible reasons you were unable to develop a DNA profile from those items of evidence?
If he didn't leave much DNA on those items of evidence, or the fact that they were found out in the elements based on when Dylan was last seen versus when these items were recovered. If they had been out in the elements for a number of months, just the environmental factors and the weather could have eliminated the ability for me to get a DNA profile from these items.
Let's talk about the bones that you received in June of 2013. Were you informed that they'd been photographed and examined visually by others in advance of coming to you at the laboratory?
Yes, I was.
And what was your role with regards to the bones that were submitted to the CBI lab?
My role was to try and develop a DNA profile from those bones to determine if those bones could have come from Dylan Redwine.
And can you tell the jury what analysis you undertook?
A portion of each of the, 2 of the 3 bones were crushed, and a portion of the crushed bone material was taken forward for DNA testing, and I was able to develop DNA profiles from both of those bones.
What's the reason you don't just swab the outside of a bone but have to crush it?
Again, I am trying to put it into a different form so that I can try and get the DNA out of the bone. Those bones, again, were several months old, just based on the color of those bones and the fact that if they did belong to Dylan Redwine, they had been in the elements for a number of months. And the bones would be somewhat degraded and broken down, so I need to get into the inside of the bone in order to get the DNA out.
Is that standard operating procedure for when a bone is recovered and DNA analysis is being conducted?
Yes, it is.
You mentioned a portion of the bone is crushed.
That's correct.
What's done with the rest of the bone?
The rest of the bone is repackaged back in the original packaging that it was submitted in and is returned to the agency.
And then correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said a portion of the portion is submitted for DNA analysis.
Correct. I crushed a portion of the bone, and then I take some of that crushed bone to do DNA in the lab. The remaining crushed portion is contained within the DNA packet.
And you mentioned you analyzed 2 bones. Are those items 19 and 20?
Yes.
CBI?
Yes, they were.
What DNA profile did you develop from item 19?
The DNA profile developed from the portion of the bone of item 19 matches the DNA profile that was previously developed from Dylan Redwine, which would have been the baby tooth.
And with regards to item 20, Strut?
The profile that was developed from that portion, the portion of the bone from item 20 matched the DNA profile previously developed from Dylan Redwine.
And from the other DNA profiles that you developed with the buccal swabs, were you able to make a conclusion as to the parents of the child?
The profiles that were developed from both item 19 and 20, the bones cannot be excluded as having originated from the child of Elaine Redwine and Mark Redwine. The percent of the population that can be excluded as biological parents of the source of items 19 and 20, which are the bones, is 99.9999998. Is that 99?
I'm going to say yes, but I'll let the record stand for itself. Either way, it's supposed to be 9 nines.
Yes, it should be 99, 9 nines, and then an 8.
Thank you. Fast forwarding to October of 2013, another search warrant is conducted in the case, and you receive additional items of evidence.
That is correct.
Fair to say lots of evidence were collected as part of this search warrant as well?
Yes, it was.
And are those items listed in your report following their submission to CBI for analysis?
Yes, they are.
Court's permission, I'm going to ask you to take us through the list of items that were submitted to CBI.
Go ahead.
There was a pair of Mark Redwine shoes, Mark Redwine shirt, which was item 21 and 22. Item 23 was Mark Redwine's pants. There was item 25, which were shoelace fragments. Item 26 was an underwear band. Item 27 is kicker headphones. Item 29 was a piece of black fabric. Item 30 was another piece of black fabric. Item 31 was the wooden threshold from the front door. Item 32 was a rug from the outside. Item 33 was a rug from inside. Item 34 was a speaker. Item 35 was a speaker. Item 36 was a black duffel bag. Item 37 was bathroom knobs. Item 38 was the P-trap from the master bathroom sink. Item 39 was the kitchen rug from under the table. Item 40 was swabs from the washing machine. Item 41 was a portion of carpet and pad from the master bedroom. Item 42 was fireplace tools. And item 3 was another piece of black fabric.
Item 43.
Yes, I'm sorry, item 43.
And did you conduct serological examinations as well as DNA analysis on many of these items?
Yes, I did.
Now, this submission is coming to you in October of 2013.
That is correct.
So what does that lapse in time from November of 2012 through October of 2013 mean in terms of your possible analysis?
Items that we're processing, we may or may not find anything probative in the 11 months in between November of 2012 and October of 2013.
Would like to, however, ask you to look at item 26, which were the swabs from the underwear, and share with the jury the results of these swabs from the underwear.
There was a partial DNA profile that was developed from the swabs of the underwear waistband that was submitted to the lab. That DNA profile matches the previously developed profile from Dylan Redwine at the interpretal location.
And then you continue to receive different items of evidence that you analyze for possible evidentiary value in the months ahead.
That's correct.
Any additional DNA work done would have been done by others after you left CBI, is that right?
That is correct.
And are you aware additional work was done on this case after you left CBI,
Yes, I am.
including with regards to some of the mixtures that you testified about earlier?
That is correct.
Just one moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
Your Honor, I have nothing further. Ms. Strut, thank you very much.
Okay. Defense?
Please.
Ms. Straub, if you have difficulty understanding me or hearing me, just let me or the judge know, and I'll speak louder or more clearly, okay?
Okay.
I want to talk briefly about kind of the basics of DNA and your analysis on DNA in general.
Okay.
And as you testified on direct, tell us what DNA stands for again, just because I want to hear it again. And you know what? I asked that question to you, so I wouldn't have to say it. I'll move on. How about that? Let's get into when we're talking about crime scene investigation, there are some limitations to DNA, and I want to talk about that, and you addressed it in your direct testimony. When you're working at the CBI lab and you run a partial profile or an entire profile or a mixture, the information you derive from that information does not tell you when that DNA was placed on a particular object, correct?
That is correct.
And it doesn't tell you when it was placed on a particular part of a house or anything like that.
That is correct.
And doesn't tell you when or how it was placed there as well.
That is correct.
And then that's because at CBI, when you're doing DNA work, you're focused with laser-like accuracy to see what this information, this DNA stuff has for you, right? You're not thinking where, when, how, right?
We are just looking at the items of evidence, and we are trying to develop a DNA profile. I can tell you whose DNA is there, but I can't tell you when it got there or how it got there.
But you know from your experience that DNA can wind up on paper, tables, carpet, hardwood floors, from a number of different ways from the body, correct?
That is correct.
And you listed some of those during your direct, correct?
Yes.
And you can leave DNA somewhere from sweating, right?
Yes, you can.
Though that's not generally DNA rich, correct?
It's not as rich as a body fluid. That's
Right.
correct.
So you can leave DNA on an object from sweat or from epithelial cells as well?
Yes.
Explain to the jury what epithelial cells are.
Epithelial cells are your skin cells. You can deposit your skin cells or epithelial cells anywhere you've been, and your DNA could be found in a location where you've been.
Point being, for demonstrative purposes, it's June, I'm in a trial. I put my hand on this table. I'm probably leaving some sweat and epithelial cells on the table.
That is correct.
You can also leave behind DNA from what you would consider to be DNA-rich fluids or biological sources, correct?
That is correct.
And some of those would include saliva
That is correct.
or seminal fluid
Yes.
or blood.
That is correct.
And someone can leave DNA on a particular object or particular part of the house if they have a nosebleed
That is correct.
or a paper cut.
Yes.
Or they pick their nose and don't wipe it.
That is possible.
And probably, I could list a lot of things, but I'm not going to. But there's a lot of ways to leave DNA behind, correct?
That is correct.
And I want to talk briefly about the notion of transfer DNA. Do you know what that is?
What exactly are you referring to when you talk about transfer?
I'll give you an example, and you tell me if I'm full of it, okay? For instance, Mr. Doherty gave the example that he could leave his DNA on the clothes of the bailiff, on the bailiff's shoulder, correct?
That is correct.
Right. You know, building on that hypothetical, if Mr. Doherty left some of his DNA on the bailiff's shoulder, on her shirt, and then for whatever reason, I had reason to touch the bailiff's shoulder in the same spot, and then took my hand off of it, I could wind up with some of Mr. Doherty's DNA on my hand, correct?
That is a possibility.
That is a possibility. It means that it happens in the world we live in.
It has been found, and yes, it is possible.
And you've seen that in your casework as an expert at CBI, correct?
I haven't seen it particularly in the casework that I've worked recently, but there are articles and there are labs who have seen that, yes.
Articles and labs have seen that. And like you said on direct testimony, you rely and keep up on those articles and other studies so that you can stay on top of your game and on point for days like today, correct?
That is correct.
And so you can stay on top of your game and on point when you're doing DNA and serology analysis, correct?
That is correct.
So building on that, Mr. Doherty can put his hand on the bailiff, leave his DNA on the shoulder. I can touch that, wind up with some of his DNA on my hand, correct?
That is correct.
And then I could put my hand on Mr. Moran's shoulder. You with me?
Yes.
And that could result in my DNA on Mr. Moran's shoulder, obviously.
Yes.
And through the process of transfer, could also result in Mr. Doherty's DNA
That is a possibility.
being on Mr. Moran's shoulder, correct?
Yes.
So now we got a situation where it's possible, and you've seen it in studies in other labs, where Mr. Doherty hasn't touched Mr. Moran, but his DNA is on Mr. Moran's shoulder, right?
That is correct.
And that's a concept and a process that you know about. And that's what I'm referring to when I say, do you know what transfer is?
Yes.
Since it's in evidence, I would ask the people, please, to republish 340, the diagram. Now, you testified about the analysis you did on CBI 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. Those are all on that, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And I want to talk about the swabs that you tested that tested negative for blood at the lab, okay?
Okay.
And the first one that, well, first explain to the court, to the jury, where you do the serology tests on items like these and what your process is. Thank you.
There is an exam room that the serology screening or serology testing is conducted in. There's a big exam table that is clean. That particular item of evidence is open. I have clean utensils that I use, and I take a small cutting from each. There's 2 swabs. I take a small cutting from each of those 2 swabs after I have taken notes and documented visually what I'm seeing on those swabs. And those small snippets are a chemical is applied, which is our phenolphthalein reagents, to test for the presumptive presence of blood.
And you did that with both items 1 and 5 in this case, correct?
Yes, I did.
And honing in on item 1, can you remind the jury, according to your recollection, involvement in the case, where that swab, where those cuts came from? Item 1.
The swabs were collected from the couch of the north wall on the east cushion. I would have taken cuttings, very small cuttings, from those particular swabs.
And your cuttings, your use of phenolphthalein on item 1.1, swabs from the couch on the north wall, came back negative for blood, correct?
That is correct.
And again, this is a phenolphthalein test, correct?
That is correct.
And phenolphthalein, as you know, can provide false positives, correct?
That is correct.
And you know that luminol can provide false positives, correct?
That is correct.
And the one thing phenolphthalein doesn't do is provide false negatives, correct?
Not that I recall.
Right. Meaning if phenolphthalein is applied to something and it doesn't glow, it's not, there's no blood there, right?
That is correct.
And can you recite to the jury how sensitive phenolphthalein is in a ratio, if you recall?
I don't recall what the ratio is.
Okay.
For how long, how dilute the sample gets to the sensitivity for detection.
You can't tell the jury it'll detect blood in 1 drop of X number.
I don't recall what the number is.
Can you remind the jury where the swabs cuttings came from for item 5, CBI?
It was the floor under the rug in front of the love seat of the south cushion.
And again, according to your serology analysis, those swabs came back negative for blood, correct?
My testing in the laboratory, they were negative for the presence of blood. That's correct.
And you offered a couple of explanations as to why these items would test presumptively positive for blood on scene, but negative at your lab. You remember talking about that?
Yes, I do.
And a couple of the reasons you offered is that, 1, luminol, the presumptive test, can dilute the sample, correct?
Right. Luminol is used when you're looking for blood that may have been cleaned up or blood that is not visible to the naked eye to begin with. And then you're applying liquid, which is luminol, and you're diluting it more. And then when you collect your sample on scene to test for phenolphthalein, you're applying moistened swabs to the stained area, and you're doing your chemical test. And then you're going back again to collect the samples that are going to be submitted to the lab with moistened swabs. So each time you're applying more liquid to the stained area.
Could be diluted, may not be diluted, safe to say.
That is correct.
And another reason you offered is that when you're conducting this serology analysis to see if blood is on these swabs from this part of the room, you're cutting a very, very, very small part off of the swab, right?
That is correct.
But you've been doing this for a long time, right?
Yes.
And you're an endorsed and recognized expert in this process, right?
That's correct.
So when you cut parts off of that swab, you're trying to get the most robust part of the swab you can to get the most information as part of your investigation, correct?
I am taking a portion of the swab that's stained that ideally would have a robust portion of the stain for me to detect blood.
Right, you're looking for the robust part of the stain on the swab, right?
That is correct, but I don't want to consume more of the swab than necessary to do the presumptive test when I'm going to take the swab forward for DNA testing.
But again, you know how to balance all of these competing mandates. Don't be consumptive, but get a robust swab, right?
That's correct.
Another reason you would get a negative test at the lab and there would be a positive test on scene is that maybe that was just a false positive on scene.
That is a possibility.
I want to turn your attention to item CBI 1 and permission to move about and
Yes.
thank you. I'm going to point to it, and I'm going to ask you to remind the jury what CBI item 1 was that you were asked to test.
It's the swab from the couch east cushion along the north wall.
And part of your DNA analysis includes quantification, correct?
That is correct.
And can you describe for the jury what quantification is?
We are using some of the extracted DNA with a kit to give us an estimate of the amount of DNA that is present in that sample.
You're trying to find out how much material is there, correct?
Yes, because our instruments are optimized for a range of DNA to get the best, most robust profile. So we are trying to estimate the amount of DNA that's present, so we either don't overload the sample and completely blow out the sample and have an overblown sample. So we're trying to optimize the amount of DNA in the range that is specific for the validations on our instrumentation.
And in the field, this is kind of referred to as the quants or quantities, correct?
The quant step, that is correct.
Okay. So when we say quants, we're talking about CBI's scientific process of estimating the quantity of DNA that you're looking at here, correct?
That's correct.
And do you recall what the quantity was for item 1?
Not without going back to all of my notes in the case.
Would looking at the quantifier duo results and batch notes help you refresh your recollection?
Yes, it would.
I have permission to approach.
Yes.
And if it helps, I think the information, as part of your analysis on section A2 1.1 S12-103, does that help you find the numbers you're looking for?
Yes.
Okay. And having refreshed your recollection with that document, what were the quantity of material here for item 1?
The human quant value for the sample when it was run was 533.43 picograms.
And is that the most accurate? Because there's a number underneath that as well, right?
The number underneath that represents the amount of male DNA that is present. The kit distinguishes between human DNA and male DNA that was used in this case.
And what was that number?
The male DNA quant was 663.37 picograms.
You said some numbers there that I bet some folks here haven't heard before. Can you tell the jurors in relationship to a single gram, 1 gram, what a picogram is?
It's 0.5 nanograms is 500 picograms, and we're targeting nanograms in our DNA process. There's a lot of DNA present in this sample, which allowed me to develop a DNA profile.
Well, that's not my question. I asked you to explain to the jury what a picogram is in relationship to a gram. What's that fraction?
I believe it is 10 to, I can't remember if it's 10 to the 6th or 10 to the 9th. I don't recall.
Well, a nanogram is 1/1000th of a gram, correct?
I don't recall.
Okay. A nanogram is actually 10 to the 9th, correct?
Again, I don't recall.
You don't recall what a nanogram or a picogram is?
A picogram is 1,000 times less than a nanogram.
And a nanogram is 1/100000th of a gram, correct?
I don't recall.
So can you tell this jury if you know that a picogram is 1/1000000000th of a gram?
I don't recall.
Nonetheless, when we're looking at these two numbers, 533 and 663, is that in picograms or nanograms?
That is in picograms.
Which may be 1/10000000th of a gram, may be 1/1000000000th of a gram, you don't know.
I don't recall.
Now, you know from keeping up with the study of DNA that, well, explain to the jury what touch DNA is.
Touch DNA is what we refer to as trace DNA. You're looking for an individual who may have touched or handled an item, and you have low amounts of DNA that are present in touch or trace samples.
And when we're talking about touch DNA, we're talking about an amount of DNA that someone can leave on an item merely by touching it, correct?
That's correct.
And you know from other studies that a mere fingerprint can leave DNA behind on an item, correct?
Yes, it can.
And that merely touching something and leaving a fingerprint, and for demonstrative purposes, I'm kind of playing with my podium here, right? Because I see you looking at me do it, right? Merely leaving a fingerprint on an item can leave between 0 and 881 picograms, correct?
Just touching a single fingerprint can leave enough DNA to get a DNA profile.
Yeah, and it can be as little as 0 to 881 picograms, correct? You know that.
Yes.
And you know that from relying on materials that you keep up with regularly, correct?
That's correct.
Materials like the Journal of Forensic Sciences, correct?
That's correct.
Because you want to know this stuff when you're doing these sorts of analysis, correct?
That is correct.
So if we know that a mere fingerprint can leave between 0 and 881 picograms of testable DNA material. What are the numbers here again on 1.1?
533.43 or 663.37 picograms.
Picograms, and that's less than 881, right?
That's correct.
But as you said, you were able to test this, so there's enough there to test, right?
Yes.
And ultimately, item 1, permission to move for the balance, thank you. Ultimately, your DNA analysis on item 1 was that Mark, Dylan, and Corey, your writing, your document, not mine, could not be excluded, correct?
That is correct.
And you gave some numbers along with that conclusion and opinion during direct, but this analysis was done in 2012, correct, December?
That is correct.
And at the time, the science, the procedures that Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI DNA Lab was using could issue a statement saying Mark Redwine, Dylan Redwine, and Corey Redwine could not be excluded, correct?
That is correct. The interpretation guidelines that were followed in 2012.
And that the interpretation guidelines that, as you testified on direct, have changed since then, right?
That is correct.
I want to turn your attention to item 3 CBI. I'll point to it. I'll ask you to describe what we're talking about when we're talking about CBI number 3. Where does this material come from, according to your understanding of the investigation?
It was swabs collected from the floor under the rug near the coffee table on the northeast corner.
And these swabs are also subject to your quantification work as well, correct?
That's correct.
And do you recall what the quantities were for CBI 3?
I do not.
Would looking at the dual quantifier results produced by CBI help you refresh your recollection?
It would.
By all means, turn your attention to CBI number 3 in that document on the first page.
They were undetermined quant values.
What does that mean exactly?
It means the microliters that were used in the quant process, there was undetermined value. There wasn't enough DNA for the instrument and the kit to detect DNA in that particular sample.
So in 2012, CBI could not determine how much DNA, how much material we're talking about in item 3.1, right?
In the 2 microliters that were used in the sample to conduct the quantitation test, there was no DNA detected in those 2 microliters.
And that's why you can't give a number on this item 3 like you could give a number in picograms on item 1, correct?
That's correct.
And again, when we're talking about item 3, those are the 2 swabs from under the rug on the floor, correct?
That is correct.
And your analysis of these swabs from that part of the house included your opinion, CBI's analysis, that Mr. Corey Redwine could not be excluded, correct?
Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine could not be excluded as potential contributors to the mixture.
And as to Mark Redwine,
Mark Redwine can be excluded.
okay. So Mark Redwine, according to CBI 2012 analysis, is excluded from item 3.1, or item 3, I'm sorry.
That is correct.
Now, this is one of the items that tested in your lab positive for blood, correct?
That is correct.
And one thing, and we know that based upon your analysis, that Corey and Dylan cannot be excluded from this mixture, correct?
That is correct.
So this is a mixture of DNA.
Yes.
And Corey and Dylan are, as you gave the statistics, are very, very likely in that mixture. Their DNA is in that mixture.
That is correct.
Now, the one thing DNA cannot tell you is who contributed the blood to that mixture, correct?
That is correct.
Meaning your analysis can't say Corey definitely contributed the blood to this material, correct?
That is correct.
You can't say Dylan definitely contributed the blood to this mixture.
All I can say is both of their DNA are in a mixture of a sample that was collected from that area.
Not my question. You can't tell this jury that definitely that Dylan contributed the blood element to that mixture, right?
That is correct.
It could be Corey's blood, Dylan's blood, or both their blood. You can't tell this jury, right?
That is correct.
Turning your attention to CBI item 5. If it's okay, can you tell the jury where that sample came from as I make my way to the TV?
It is swabs from the floor under the rug in front of the love seat of the south cushion.
And again, on People's 340, we're talking about this one right here, right?
That's correct.
And again, that's a sample that at your lab tested negative for blood, correct?
That is correct.
And do you recall what the quantities of material were for that item?
I do not.
With looking at the dual quantifier results, help refresh your recollection by looking at the line that refers to 5.1.
Yes, it would. The human quant is listed as undetermined. The male quant was 8.19 picograms.
Human quantity, not enough to detect in that 2-liter process. Am I hearing that?
In the 2 microliter sample that was put onto the instrument, it was undetected.
But the male DNA came out at 8.19 picos, as we say in the field, right?
Correct.
And again, you can't tell the jury if a picogram is a billionth or a trillionth
Objection,
of a
Your Honor,
gram.
asked and answered.
It has been.
What were your DNA results as far as contributors to this material?
For item number 5,
Yes, ma'am.
there was a mixture of at least 2 contributors. Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine cannot be excluded as potential contributors.
And this is the same one where CBI could not render a conclusion as to Mr. Mark Redwine.
That is correct.
But the one takeaway from CBI 2012 was that Corey and Dylan could not be excluded.
Correct.
And again, this is one of those results where we have competing information from the scene and from the lab, correct?
The scene detected presumptive positive for phenolphthalein at the scene, and the lab was negative for presumptive blood on the swab.
And you've already testified why that happens.
Yes.
But similar concept, slightly different sample here, the DNA analysis doesn't tell you who may have contributed the blood portion to this material, correct?
That's correct.
Could have been one, the other, or both,
Correct.
or neither, since your lab said this wasn't blood, right?
Since the presumptive screening at the lab was negative for the presence of blood, that's correct.
Turning your attention to item number 6 on the diagram. Yeah, they put 1 and then they put 6, but what's...
That was swabs from the coffee table on the northeast corner.
And with looking at the dual quantifier result, inform your memory as to what the quantity of material was for this item number 6 in the corner of the coffee table.
Yes, it would.
By all means.
The human quant was 336.11 picograms. The male quant was 395.46 picograms.
And this was another item that in your lab came back with phenolphthalein, positive for blood, right?
It was presumptive positive for blood.
Presumptive positive for blood, because that's the way phenolphthalein works, right? It's a presumptive test.
That's correct.
And describe for the jury what your conclusions were regarding contributions to this mixture.
It was a mixture. Mark Redwine and Dylan Redwine cannot be excluded as potential contributors to this mixture. Elaine Redwine, Mr. Stone, and Corey Redwine could be excluded as potential contributors to the mixture.
And the same rule applies to the corner of the coffee table, number 6, as applies to your analysis on these other matters, in that DNA cannot tell you, your analysis cannot tell you who may have contributed the blood element to this material, correct?
That is correct.
Could be Mark, could be Dylan, could be both, could be neither, because it's a presumptive test, correct?
That's correct.
Turning your attention to item 2, I'm pretty confident it's one of those ones on the right side of the diagram. Can you describe for the jury again where this sample came from, according to information you received as part of your analysis?
It swabs from the south cushion of the love seat.
And we're looking at the dual quantifier results. Help refresh your recollection to how much material we're talking about in item 2, love seat, south cushion.
Yes, it would.
By all means.
The human quant value for item 2 was 1,952.98 picograms, and the male quant value was 1,942.25 picograms.
And again, we're talking picograms here, right?
That's correct.
I think we can take that down. You also did an analysis on a CBI item number 4. Can you remind us all what that was, please?
That was pipe near the washing machine, swabs that were collected from the pipe near the washing machine.
And ultimately, you tested that with phenolphthalein as well, correct?
Yes, I did.
And again, that's a presumptive test to determine whether or not blood is in that material, correct?
That's correct.
And the phenolphthalein on item before the pipe by the washing machine, was it the washing machine or, I'm sorry,
Yes, it was the washing machine.
the pipe by the washing machine, that had a weak reaction to the phenolphthalein, correct?
That is correct.
And we got a weak phenolphthalein reaction, and also, as you testified, no DNA profile could be developed from that.
That's correct.
And one explanation as to why the swabs from the pipe had a weak phenolphthalein reaction and a profile could not be developed because it's possible that's animal blood, correct?
There was a quant value associated with the DNA profile from 4.1.
And you've spoken about this case to investigators on the prosecution, correct?
Yes,
And I think you've met with Investigator Heidel as well, correct?
that's correct.
And do you recall telling him on January 26, 2017, that this weak reaction and no DNA profile could be attributed to the fact that those swabs go to animal blood?
That is a possibility.
Nonetheless, you did get some quants, correct?
I did get a male quant, yes,
And that was again in picograms.
that's correct.
And that item was not subject to any further testing, correct?
After the DNA testing, no.
Turning your attention to your report from January 14, 2013, you did a serology analysis of I think what you described as a Nerf football, correct?
That's correct.
And that analysis included, and when was this exactly? I mean, right around January 2013?
The request was submitted January 14th of 2013,
When was the date of your report?
February 14th of 2013.
And you did a visual inspection of the football, didn't find any blood, correct?
That's correct.
And you did a phenolphthalein test as well?
Yes, I swabbed the entire football in different sections and tested those for phenolphthalein, and they were all negative for the presumptive presence of blood.
And you did not swab it for DNA, correct?
Swabs were taken of the football. I did not do any DNA testing on those swabs.
My bad. Swabs were taken, they weren't processed for DNA.
I did not process them for DNA.
Now, you've testified about what you know about touch DNA and transfer DNA and DNA that was found underneath a carpet and DNA that's found other places in the house. You've been talking about that all morning, safe to say?
That's correct.
Now, remind the jury how long you've been doing this sort of serological DNA work one more time.
I've been doing DNA testing since 2005 and serology since 2003.
Well over 10 years, sounds like 15 years. I wasn't doing the math.
Yes.
And in your analysis in serology, serology is basically the kind of the forensic study of blood, correct?
It is the examination of physical evidence for body fluids to include blood.
Right. And what you know from your experience in serology is that someone can experience a bloodletting event like getting punched, correct?
Yes.
And then they won't start to bleed until after the item that punched them or hit them is away from their body, correct?
Correct.
Meaning, hope it wouldn't. I could get punched in the face, fist moves away, then I bleed.
That's correct.
Or someone could throw a ball in my face, the ball could bounce off, and then that would result in the bloodletting after I'm no longer in contact with the ball.
That's correct.
You testified on direct that you also did some testing on a sock, a shoelace, and a shoe. I believe that's in your June 2013 report, if I can steer you in that direction.
That's correct.
And we've talked about different ways folks can leave DNA on stuff a bunch this morning. I want to revisit that briefly. We talked about how, and you agreed that you can leave DNA on materials with sweat, epithelial cells, saliva, seminal fluid, blood, and others, correct?
That's correct.
And based upon your expertise, some of those materials are more DNA rich than others, correct?
That's correct.
For instance, and I think you gave this as an example, if not, we'll talk about it. Blood is more DNA rich than saliva, or at least, strike that. Blood is more DNA rich than sweat.
That is correct.
So, when you did the initial serological analysis of the sock, shoelace, and shoe, did you know where those were coming from?
I believe they were recovered from out in somewhere in the mountain areas where the same location that the bones were recovered.
And your determination was there was no blood on the Nike Air Jordan shoe, Fila sock, or shoelace, correct?
I did presumptive screening, testing on those items, and they were all negative for the presumptive presence of blood.
You also did, serological analysis on several more items found from Mr. Redwine's house, correct?
That's correct.
And to steer your attention to, I believe it's your August 28th, 2013 report, correct?
The submission was August 28th of 2013. My report should be October 18th of 2013.
I wrote down the submission dates, and I'm gonna be off, and I'm gonna get better at this. I apologize for the confusion. And this was also the report or the investigation you did, where you talked about this on direct, where you were asked to do serology on several items, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And some of those, and a lot of that included stuff that was found up on Middle Mountain, and some of it included stuff that was found in Mr. Redwine's house, correct?
That is correct.
And one of the things you tested to see if presumptively there was blood was Mr. Redwine's shoes.
That is correct.
And that's item 21, correct?
Yes.
And when I say Mr. Redwine, I mean Mr. Mark Redwine. You tested Mr. Mark Redwine's shoes for the presumptive presence of blood, correct?
That is correct.
And that came back negative, correct?
That's correct.
You also tested Mr. Mark Redwine's shirt for the presumptive presence of blood, correct?
That is correct.
And can you describe to the jury what your process is for taking cuttings from a shirt, what your process was for taking cuttings from Mr. Mark Redwine's shirt?
There would have been a visual examination done on the shirt to identify any possible stained areas that could be blood. Those items would have been marked, and I would have swabbed those areas for testing presumptively for blood.
And do you recall how many areas you swabbed?
Not with going back to my notes.
Nonetheless, all the swabs you took of Mr. Mark Redwine's shirt that was provided to you by law enforcement tested negative for blood.
That's correct.
And again, this is with phenolphthalein.
Yes, that's correct.
You also tested Mr. Mark Redwine's pants in the same vein. Do you recall how many swabs and what your process was for pants? Is it different for pants than shirts?
No, it would have been the same process, and I don't recall the number without referring to my notes.
And all the swabs from Mr. Mark Redwine's pants came back negative for blood, correct?
That's correct.
And as to some of the items in the house that you tested, that included something described as the wooden threshold of the front door. Can you explain to us what that is?
It was the threshold that was collected from the front door area.
Is that like a piece of wood or what is it?
I believe it was.
Okay. According to your serology, negative for blood, correct?
That's correct.
Outside rug outside the front door, negative, correct?
That's correct.
Rug inside the front door, negative, correct?
That is correct.
You also had to test to what I understand to be audio speakers, correct?
That is correct.
Speaker number 1, item 34, negative for blood, correct?
Correct.
Speaker number 2, item 35, negative, correct?
That is correct.
Rug from the kitchen, under the kitchen table, negative for blood, correct? Item 39.
The visual examinations of that particular rug did not reveal stains characteristics of blood. So there was no presumptive test on that because there was no areas that visually appeared to be blood.
No reason to test that based upon your expert analysis.
Correct.
How about the black duffel bag, item 36? Is that one that you looked at and didn't bother to test, or is that one?
There were areas that I tested and they were negative for the presence of blood.
Do you recall how many areas of the black duffel bag you tested?
I do not.
You also tested swabs from the washing machine, item 40, correct?
That is correct.
And those came back presumptively negative for blood, right?
Yes.
You tested the carpet in the master bedroom. That came back negative as well, correct? Item 41. Or did you eyeball that one? Maybe I got my numbering wrong. I'll move on. What do you have for item number 42?
42 is the fireplace tools.
And inform the jury what the fireplace tools were based upon your analysis, your investigation of this case.
It was the fireplace tool stand, the fireplace poker, the fireplace shovel, the fireplace grabber or clamp, and the fireplace brush.
All those tested negative for blood, correct?
That is correct.
And now I found it. It's item 41. It's a portion of the carpet from the pad from the master bedroom, correct?
That is correct, and it was just visual examinations again, so there was no areas that were tested.
Again, based upon your visual assessment, no need to test, right?
That's correct.
Moving to the items you did an analysis on from up in the mountains, that included black shirt pieces, item 24.
There were, yes,
Shoelace fragments,
yes,
kicker headphones,
that is correct.
black fabric 1, 2, and 3, items 29, 30, and 43, correct?
Correct.
All those came back negative for blood, correct?
That's correct.
Either from visual analysis or from phenolphthalein, right?
That is correct.
I think you were also asked to do serology analysis on more items. I think the submission date was May 12th, 2014. You recall working on some items right around then?
The date of my report was May 12th of 2014.
And what did you analyze for that report?
There was blonde hair that was submitted, a broom with hair on the handle, and a tire iron and jack bag that were submitted.
And serology returned a negative result on the broom, correct? Item 44.
There were hairs that were collected from the broom. The only item that was screened for the presence of blood was the tire iron and jack bag.
And those came back negative, correct?
That's correct.
And The hair that was on the broom, where's your understanding where this broom was taken from?
I do not recall.
Okay. And no further analysis was done on a hair stuck on a broom, correct?
Not that I'm aware of.
And again, DNA can tell us a lot, but it can't tell us everything, right?
It can tell you whose DNA is there, but it can't tell you how it got there.
Right. And it can't tell you if a particular sample or material has been subject to cleanup, correct?
That's correct.
And one thing you mentioned about how you do your DNA analysis, or maybe, forgive me, maybe it's serology. You take the item out of the package, you test it, put it back in the package, and then you do a cleanup between items, correct?
That's correct.
And describe for the jury what that cleanup process is.
The item of evidence is, when it's opened on a piece of paper. That exam paper is returned with the item of evidence. After the exam paper and the evidence is placed back in the bag, the exam table is wiped down with a 10% bleach solution. Then it is wiped down with distilled water. Then it is wiped down with a reagent alcohol solution.
And the reason you do this, hypothetical coming here, is that if you do a serology analysis on item 1 on the table, then you repackage it and put it away, you don't want anything from item 1 to get on item 2, right?
Yes, we are trying to prevent any cross-contamination between items.
Because cross-contamination would be like that transfer thing you and I were talking to, and then the whole process and the results would be suspect, right?
Correct.
And then that's why you're super careful about this, right?
That's why we have protocols in place to eliminate and try and prevent any contamination or cross-contamination between items.
Because some biological material, some DNA from item 1 winds up on the table, you don't...
Move on.
You use a 10%...
I'm sorry. You're talking about the cleaning still?
I have one more question as to 10% bleach, Judge.
All right.
I was laying the foundation, thank you. You use 10% bleach to mop up that table, correct?
That's correct.
And that's because based upon your training and expertise, that a solution of 10% bleach will take care of all of the DNA on that table, right? Meaning get rid of it.
That's correct.
10% bleach.
That's correct.
Can you describe for the jury what the process of degradation is when we're talking about DNA? What makes DNA degrade?
DNA can be degraded through bleach solutions. It can be degraded through UV light and other environmental factors. Heat can degrade DNA.
It's safe to say degradation occurs over time, not all at once.
Yes.
And any number of environmental factors, liquid, UV rays, can make DNA, and by degrade we mean dissolve, go away, right?
Go away so that we cannot get an interpretable DNA profile.
Right. And degradation can happen indoors or outdoors, right?
That's correct.
It can happen on just about any surface, correct?
That's correct.
And how fast it happens depends on the environmental factors and what kind of surface we're talking about and how much DNA is there, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And it's a natural process.
Not sure what you mean by natural, but
I'll withdraw the question, and I don't think I have any further questions.
Redirect, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Straub? The exhibit that we had on the screen, number 340, I'm going to put it back on the screen with course permission.
Go ahead.
This is with regards to evidence that was submitted to your laboratory in December of 2013, am I right?
December of
2012.
2012.
Yes, thank you for catching that. Is that right?
Yes, I believe so.
And counsel just took you through a list of items that were submitted in late 2013.
That's correct.
So the analysis that we've spent time talking about here today was conducted on items that were submitted to your lab and analyzed in December of 2012.
That's correct.
And based on your analysis, is it your opinion that there were swabs that tested presumptively positive blood in one location or multiple locations within that room?
That is correct.
Which one, sorry?
There were multiple locations in that room where they tested presumptive positive for blood.
Council spent some time talking about transfer DNA, where I touched the bailiff's shoulder, just getting a lot of physical interaction during this testimony today. I touch the bailiff's shoulder, then Mr. Bogan comes over, touches her shoulder, takes my DNA from that touch, brings it back, touches Mr. Moran, and you said it's a possibility now that my DNA is left on Mr. Moran. Is that right?
Yes.
How often have you seen that in your actual career?
I don't recall seeing it in any of the cases that I've done.
So possibility meaning like scientific possibility, but you've never seen it in all the years you've been doing DNA.
That's correct.
Let's assume it happens. Would the investigators find any blood in Mr. Moran's living room?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
I'm asking is if the transfer DNA possibility, which you've never seen in your career, would also explain why we're having presumptive positives for blood in multiple locations in the living room.
So somebody would have had to have transferred the blood from one location to another from another individual?
Yes, ma'am.
I can't say whether or not that could happen or not.
Have you ever seen that in your career?
I have not.
Mr. Bogan was asking you some questions about the weight, the human quant value
Yes.
of the DNA. Do you often see pounds of DNA being submitted to the lab?
No.
And in fact, you're using swabs to collect the DNA, right?
That's correct.
So it's basically, the buccal swab is like a long Q-tip, right?
That's correct.
So you never see a buccal swab where it shows up in your weight as, oh, this is 3 pounds of someone's DNA.
No.
But you said, in answering the question, and I want to let you complete your answer, there was a lot of DNA present in the sample. What do you mean by that?
The target value of our instruments, the optimal target is between 0.5 or 500 picograms and 100 or 1,000 picograms. That's the optimum target that we're looking for, and we try to get our samples after the quant. We make dilutions to target that amount of DNA. That's a lot of DNA for us to get a DNA profile from that can be interpreted. If we have smaller amounts of DNA, we use more of the actual sample to try and create a DNA profile.
Just explain that in a little more detail in terms of using more of the DNA.
When we are trying to target and get it in that optimum range, we may have to dilute a sample. So we're adding our dilutions to create the optimum target. If the quant value is well below our optimum range, we're going to use no dilution of that sample to try and get our DNA profile.
Let's say, just to take a step back for a moment, you have a sex assault case that's been submitted to the lab, and there's a substance that's believed to be semen that was recovered from bed sheets. You've seen that in your career, right?
Yes.
Many, many, many occasions.
Yes.
Let's start with the quant value. What kind of quant value would you expect to see or hope to see in the swabs from the bed sheets?
We could get extremely high quant values, thousands of picograms, and we have to dilute it down to our target range that our instrument for the optimum profile.
And what's the reason you have to do that?
So that we are not overblowing the instrument and having an overblown sample so that we can actually do an interpretation. If we have an overblown sample, we may have peaks that are being called that are not true peaks because we have too much DNA there. So we need to dilute and get in the optimum range.
And for many of the things you've discussed on cross-examination, were you within that range?
Yes.
Counsel asked you if you, and something we covered on direct, if you can determine, who contributed blood as opposed to who contributed trace DNA. And what was your answer for that?
I cannot determine. I can just state whose DNA is in a swab or in a sample that I did DNA on. I can't tell you what percentage is blood and what percentage is not blood.
And how is it possible that you could have two individuals contributing DNA to a location that has tested presumptively positive for blood in the laboratory?
There's somebody's DNA that was there and blood was deposited on top of that area where their DNA had been deposited. The swab is collected from that area. You're going to swab the blood up as well as the location where the stain was.
So, for example, as a hypothetical, the defendant, Mark Redwine, had moved the coffee table, and in moving the coffee table touched the northeast corner with his hand. It's possible that he would leave touch DNA.
That's correct.
And if at a later time, Dylan Redwine bled on the table, he would also leave DNA there.
That is possible.
And touch DNA from blood, you can't tell which is which. You could just tell whose DNA was deposited there.
That's correct.
How about with regard to item number 2? See there, the presence of blood based on the presumptively positive test at the scene, but also in the laboratory. And whose DNA profile did you get from that sample in item number 2?
Dylan Redwine.
Just one moment, Your Honor.
Take it down. Well, don't. One moment.
I just need... Thank you, Your Honor. Just to clarify, your DNA analysis, item number 2 excludes Mark Redwine, is that right?
Item number 2 was a single source profile that matched Dylan Redwine.
Which means what?
It means there was not DNA from Mark Redwine or any other involved individuals in this case.
And what is the likelihood of anybody else on planet Earth having the same DNA as what you described as matching Dylan?
The estimated frequency of that particular profile in the general population is 1 in 28 quintillion.
Counsel asked you about punches to the face causing bleeding. Do you recall that line of cross-examination? And whether you'd always expect blood to be left on the fist, right?
Yes.
In your experience, fair to say not every punch causes bleeding?
That is correct.
So black eye, broken nose, punch to the back of the head may not result in bleeding.
That is correct.
And for all the blood samples, or the presumptively positive blood samples from the living room, what one person can't be excluded from those?
Dylan?
DNA. Sorry.
Dylan Redwine.
And in your expert opinion, Ms. Strub, does that mean it's more likely than not that Dylan Redwine bled at multiple locations in this room?
There was blood.
Objection, foundation. She's already testified to these issues, and I don't think she can say what happened. She can say what her DNA analysis was. This opinion calls for more than that.
Mr. Doherty?
And I think this was covered at length in cross-examination, and I think it's an appropriate opportunity for the witness to clarify for the jury her expert opinion and analysis based on the forensic serology and forensic DNA analysis.
think it's within her expertise, and it is in response to cross-examination. So you can ask the question again.
Thank you, Your Honor.
There was blood that was identified in the living room at the scene that came back to Dylan Redwine.
Blood was located in multiple locations within the living room.
That's correct.
I have nothing further. Thank you, Ms. Strut.
Questions from the jury? Counsel can approach. Okay. I'm just going to read the first question into the record. I don't expect you to answer this, okay? Can you remind us the finishing date for the installation of the new floor? This witness is not somebody who could answer that. Question number 2, I do want you to answer. DNA was not found on Dylan's actual clothing, shoelaces, socks, question marks made, all those things. Is that all correct?
That is correct. There was no profiles developed from the shoes, the sock, or the shoelace.
And then the third question looks like it was answered according to the this piece of paper with the questions on it. So any follow-up from either side?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Bogan?
No follow-up.
Okay, with that, we'll take our, oh, you can be excused, excuse me.
Am I?
Your Honor, may,
Or can't you be excused, I should ask.
I was going to ask, can she be excused from the subpoena, please, Your Honor?
Mr. Bogan?
You can be released from our subpoena, yes.
Okay, you're free to go. Thank you. So with that, we will take our lunch recess. Please remember my admonitions about not talking about the case. Don't talk to anyone else. Don't do any research on your own. Don't visit anywhere. Of course, you won't have any time to do that. And we will see you back here. It's 5 after. We said it'd be 45 minutes, so 10 to 1. All right? Everybody rise for the jury? Good. Okay. The exhibits from the first witness, I don't know if you got the numbers back there. Which numbers? The ones that were, we admitted a pile of. He stated all numbers, and I stated they were all admitted as he read them. So I think we're covered. I have a mark as being admitted. But while we're still on the record, I was going to do this later. I'm warning both of you that if I think, since we're behind, we need to speed things up. If I think you're going over the same thing multiple times, you're going to hear from me, and that's what's happened so far. So we'll go to both sides.
Thank you, Your Honor.